Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Austin. I was here at the very first one of these conferences, and I've done many of the conferences across the country. I love it because DJ runs an amazing event to bring all of the players that have a seat at the healthcare table into one conference. There are so many conferences that just deal with one aspect of healthcare, and that's why this is a very valuable addition to the national conversation. We will be moving very fast here today. I have 71 slides and 30 minutes. It's going to be a roller coaster of emotion, and if you can just glean one thing that you learned from it, I will be happy. My name is Colm. I worked in democratic politics. I worked, though, in government. I worked for Mayor O'Malley in Baltimore. I worked for Governor O'Malley in the state of Maryland, and then I ran the Democratic Governors Association, and right now I partner with the former head of the Republican Governors Association to run a state-based consulting firm. So we're still in the healthcare space. We represent many of the folks who are here sponsoring today, and so we're engaged constantly in that conversation, as is everybody. Let's get going then. Iowa happened yesterday. Allegedly, maybe. If no vote is ever revealed, does that tree fall in the forest? Has that election ever occurred? But what it does mean is that, as Churchill said, we're not at the end, we're not at the beginning of the end, but we are at the end of the beginning. And we are starting our long trek to the Minneapolis Convention, and that trek is going to bring us through many states, but it starts in Iowa. What did we learn in Iowa? Well, I think what we learned was, if we know one thing, as a result of the Iowa election, Mike Bloomberg has doubled his campaign staff commitment from 1,000 staffers across America to 2,000 staffers this afternoon. He has doubled his media buy because he believes, I think, that Joe Biden came in fourth, and a distant fourth, after Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and Elizabeth Warren. And so he's gearing up for a campaign, I think, to make sure that Sanders doesn't get the nomination. I think that's Bloomberg's MO. Let's move along. What we did learn was that, once again, the number one issue coming out of Iowa, healthcare. Where are we, though, as a nation? Because it's been an absolute roller coaster. In the last week alone, we've seen impeachment, Brexit, Super Bowl, wildfires, Iowa Caucus, State of the Union, Middle East peace deal, China Phase 1, sneaky rollback of clean water regulations, the rollout of Medicaid block grants, we're not allowed to call it that, but that's what it is, and the coronavirus, a worldwide pandemic that's probably going to kill us all in our beds. And that's just in the last 2 weeks. It's no wonder that the American political establishment is roiling and behaving in a way that it hasn't behaved before. And this is where it leaves the voters. For the last 30 years, the nation has been on the wrong track, and right now, 60+% of the American voter thinks the country's moving in the wrong direction. This is the first time ever that a president has never broken 50% in approval. And really, what this chart is meant to show a little bit is the polarization of the two groups of voters in America. And that the fact that that line never intersects, and that the president won with 46.7% of the vote in the last election, shows that A, he can be re-elected quite easily, and B, that he is never going to get over 50% of Americans to support him. In fact, 53% of Americans say that they would never vote for him under any circumstances. You can see the physical polarization that has led to that in this map, where there's a literal wall of red in the middle and two blue coasts. And people are in no mood to compromise, because that's what polarization does. We've switched from saying that people have bad ideas to people are bad people. We see the other side as a threat to the nation. Nearly 50% of Republican voters see Democrats as a threat to the nation. And they're telling their elected officials, don't compromise, because you can't compromise with bad people. And this one is kind of amazing. I just came across this from John Della Volpe, an old pollster friend of mine who polls for the Kennedy School at Harvard every year. And if you look at this chart, it's kind of remarkable. People are so alienated from their institutions that when asked, are these institutions helping you or preventing you from achieving the American dream? This is what people say. Sure, President Trump is making the American dream more difficult. 50% of people believe that. 30% think he's helping. But the Democratic Party, 24% think they're helping them achieve the American dream. 40% think they're not. Colleges and universities, 43% of people think that colleges and universities are preventing them from achieving the American dream, and only 22% think they're helping. K through 12 is even worse. Wall Street, sure, 45% think that they are preventing us achieving our dream, as is the judiciary. And of course, US Congress, 56% of people think that they are preventing us achieving our American dream. And as my old partner Phil would always say, who are the 10% who think that Congress is helping you achieve your American dream? We'd all like to meet them. But it's also producing some strange and counterintuitive positions among the electorate. 6 in 10 Republicans who earn less than $50,000 a year, which is a growing part of the Republican Party, say that big corporations have too much power and that they should be taxed more. Exactly half the correspondents surveyed this year in a youth poll run out of Harvard again, half of them say, 25% say that they think that capitalism is broken, and 25% say that they think capitalism is not working for them, and that's half the respondents. 41% have a positive view of capitalism, but 31% have a positive view of socialism, and 39% have a positive view of democratic socialism, maybe because that's what Bernie is, or maybe they just see the democratic label in front. They're for a federal jobs guarantee, they're for free public college up to $125,000 a year, and they support single payer by 55%. These are the emerging voters. Majority of voters think we should raise taxes and tax corporations more, and 8 out of last 10 elections were change elections, throw the bums out. That's why people are putting more energy and time into non-traditional institutions, organizations that have people power, non-government organizations, global organizations, unions. It's changing the way we do business in America, certainly politically, but in every aspect of our lives. How did we get here? Well, I think that we got here because people were feeling extremely angry and anxious for the last 30 years, and change was happening slowly, and it manifested quickly in the presidential election that elected Donald Trump as a cry for help. They'd been sending signals. People are really anxious and concerned about a world where we've got dramatically changing demographics. We've got globalization in the last 30 years, tech revolution, industrial farming, putting ordinary farmers out of business, anxiety about the future. And those that lost their jobs in 2008, when they got them back, they didn't get the same job back at the same rate of pay. Many employers took the opportunity to automate or offshore some of those jobs, or just pay less for them. 8 out of 10 of the last elections were change elections. People were telling us what they were thinking. I think it all goes back to this chart, what the economists call the great decoupling, which is when median income flatlined in the face of increasing GDP and productivity. They had always gone hand in hand until about 30 years ago, when in the last 30 years we saw the stock market increase by 570%, and we saw GDP go up by 112%, real wages went up by 18%. I think that's the most important chart that we will see, because it underlines and I think informs these great anxieties, the 5 great anxieties: income anxiety, college affordability anxiety, housing anxiety, talked about all the time in a way that it was never talked about before. It's fueling the great migration of people from the coasts to places like Arizona and Texas. Retirement insecurity, and a often signaled fear of healthcare costs. We saw this bubble up as a conversation point in the last year, as a kind of a touch point to what ordinary people are really feeling. A tremendous amount of Americans are only $400 away from financial insecurity and not being able to meet their bill payments. 20% of non-college educated white people can't afford to pay their bills right now, and 16% of them could not afford to pay. Another 16% couldn't afford to pay them if they were hit with a $400 financial hardship. You know, I think that these are the people who are yearning for a return to when America was great. And I think that they perceive that as a time when you can work the line in General Motors. You could send your kids to state school. You afforded to live in your nice house in Detroit. You went for 2 weeks vacation every year. Your kid was upwardly mobile. They weren't going to work the line at General Motors. Your retirement was being taken care of by the company. And now 36% of Americans, only 36, say that they think they're prepared for retirement. And experts tell you that 36% is actually not prepared for retirement. And underlying it is also this amazing demographic change that we're going through. In 1960, the white population was 85% in the United States. In 2000, it's 67%, and in 2050, it'll be 47%. In 1980, the white vote was 80% when Ronald Reagan got elected. In 2020, it'll be 66% this year, and in 10 years' time, it'll be 60%. 23%, quirkily, 23% of Catholics, of Americans say they are Catholics, 23% say that they are evangelical Christians, and 23% said that they are agnostics. That's a dramatic change from a country that was a conservative Protestant country until about 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, the largest group in the Democratic Party when it comes to religion are people who say they don't have a religion. So, tremendously anxiety-inducing facts. And the political outcome of that was the election of Donald Trump and of Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House. We look at the political impact since Trump got elected with 3 data points. Virginia was the first canary in the mine shaft that something was happening. Virginia, a purple state, that in 2017 had an off-year election for governor and legislature, and we saw this massive swing of Rockefeller Republicans in the suburbs to become Democrats. We saw a huge turnout of women. We saw Democrats take back the governor's mansion. And of course, we saw healthcare was the #1 issue on the doorsteps. We were surprised to see that. Republicans were surprised to see that. They didn't know if healthcare was a proxy for anti-Trump sentiment, or if healthcare really was emerging as the dominant conversation point in the United States. And then in 2018, the midterms, huge collection of data points as to where we were in the Trump era. We had unprecedented turnout. In Texas, you had nearly presidential levels of turnout in a midterm year. And of course, this is the one that I like. Generation X and millennials outvoted baby boomers for the first time. As Donald Trump would say, people are saying that Generation X are the best looking and smartest of the generations. You'll all know what I mean, those of you that are Generation X out there. But really what we know is that boomers are the impediment in some ways to progress, because, this is my theory, but you know, boomers have all the spoils of all the hard political work that was done. They don't really worry as much about those 5 great anxieties. Their retirement is taken care of with Social Security and the pensions that the big companies used to have. Medicaid, Medicare is in great shape for them. They don't have college debt. They live in their house that they're going to retire in. And they don't have college affordability, and their health care issues are largely taken care of. So they're okay with the dysfunction in Washington if it doesn't disturb their lives. The next generation have a much more progressive approach to solution to all those problems and are much less tolerant of a dysfunctional Washington not taking care of the issues. Millennial turnout doubled between 2014 and 2018, and it's not because they just got off the couch, it's because millennials are a huge cohort. And they were coming of age. Millennials now are no longer the hipster kids. They're 40 years of age. And they're emerging as the most dominant force in American politics. Same chart telling you the same thing. The last data point was in 2019 when we had a gubernatorial 3 elections in Republican states. We won in Louisiana, Trump country. We won in Kentucky, a state that Donald Trump had won by double-digit points. And again, Governor Beshear won by turning out Rockefeller Republicans in the Lexington suburbs and the Cincinnati suburbs. This is probably the most important chart that we'll look at, and we'll dwell on it just for a minute. In 2014, Republicans won Asians and 36% of Hispanics. In 2018, they lost Asians for the first time ever, and they got 29% of Hispanics. But the Hispanic vote has gone from 8% of the electorate to 11% of the electorate. You can't continue to win if you're going to get a smaller share of the bigger group of voters. Education's the new cleavage, and the Republicans lost women by 19 points in the midterms, as opposed to just losing them by 4 points in 2014, 4 years before. Every year, college-educated voters make up a larger part of the electorate. That's why they are a very important voting bloc to move over towards Democrats. You know, when income was the cleavage in American political life, these college-educated voters were split. But now we're seeing them move as suburban voters over to the Democratic Party, and it's having a dramatic change on the country. How did Democrats eventually get it right? Well, they focused in the midterms on healthcare. Number one, healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. Instead of being distracted and making it a referendum on Donald Trump and his behavior or issues that he would like to talk about, but at the end of the day, if you Democrats spent the vast majority of their money and had the vast majority of their ads about healthcare. Republicans thought taxes would be a much more important issue than it was, and I think that they misdirected some of their funding in that regard. Also, we outraised, for the first time ever, Democrats were able to outraise Republicans as a small donor. Platforms and social media are driving money to Democratic candidates as opposed to big dollar donors. We see that right now. Everybody's aware of that in the presidential election. But mainly the reason why we did big was because of this man, 60% of moderates voted Democrat in the midterms. The real question is, can we hold those moderates as we go into this year's presidential election? They're a vital part of the conversation, and we remember that Barack Obama was shellacked in the 2012 midterms. He was shellacked in the 2010 midterms, but he won the presidency in 2012. So the midterms aren't always an indicator of continued support for your party. This just shows how the suburbs are really the crucial vote. You know, Democrats always won the urban areas. Republicans won the rural areas, but there were a lot less votes in the rural areas. Republicans owned the landscape in suburban America. That was where the Republican Party had most of its strength. And Democrats didn't beat Republicans in the suburbs in 2018, but they held them to a draw, and that was enough for the big urban Democratic vote to outpace the Republican rural vote. We dominate the coasts, which makes it look very empty in the middle, but the vast majority of people live on the coasts. The presidential election is fought on 4 things: turnout, the economy, candidates, and events. Turnout is reaching levels that we haven't seen since 1896. This bottom bar is the last of 4 surveys that CNN does in the year before a presidential election. It has always been the harbinger of increased turnout. Whatever the public said the year before, they have always turned out in greater numbers. In June 2019, nearly 74% of the public said that they were likely or extremely enthusiastic about voting, which leads us to believe that we could hit 80% in turnout. That'll turn out a lot of young people, it'll turn out a lot of rural voters. It changes the landscape because it's very difficult to do polling, very difficult to gauge where you're going to put your resources, unless you know where the voters are going to be. When it comes to the economy, Donald Trump should be re-elected. Virtually no president doesn't get re-elected with a booming economy in peacetime. Economic confidence is at a 20-year high. And in fairness, most voters, 52%, give Donald Trump credit for the economy that we have. But for the first time ever, the economy is not the most important issue. Not alone that, it's at the lowest point it's been for at least 30 years in the electorate's self-offered list of important issues that face them. Of course, number one is healthcare. The only states that matter, actually in this election, which is a bit of a heartbreaker for a lot of people to realize, is, this is the expanded map where Donald Trump thinks he can get 8.8 non-college educated white voters that didn't vote for him last time to vote for him. It'll actually come down to 4 states. There are 6, but it'll probably come down to 4. And in reality, it could well come down to just 1. So the 6 are Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, Ohio. And he's going to concentrate on the rural voters that like his trade and his immigration policies in those small counties and try and turn them out. Many people feel that Wisconsin is really going to be the battleground state of battleground states. It makes some assumptions. It makes the assumption that Trump wins North Carolina. So my question is, are the voters in these states, in this corridor, in the middle, the Michigan, the Wisconsin, the Ohio, the Pennsylvanias, are they better off now than they were 4 years ago? There's a mild recession in manufacturing. Last year, we only created 197,000 manufacturing and construction jobs, even though we have created 1.3 million of those jobs in the last 3 years. So while the president is going to say we have a booming economy, will it feel like that for those voters in that state? And obviously, the farmers in those states have been decimated by a trade war. And I think that Obama suffered in his midterms because he touted a booming economy. And it was a recovering economy. It had a booming stock market. It had a great trajectory for unemployment numbers. But people didn't feel it. And will these voters feel it, or will they feel like it's a disconnected message for their daily lives? And I would go so far as to say the real question that Democrats should ask is, has the president, not just touting a stock market that you're not really part of, or an unemployment number that is not paying you enough to live on, has he dealt with those 5 anxious friction points in your life? I think in the knowledge that he may have some problems in this area, the president has moved to take care of some issues. And so he rolled out a successful USMCA to take care, I think, of some of those voters in the middle of the country, in that deep red corridor, which is a trade corridor from Canada to Mexico, particularly auto workers. He also is hyping a very modest, very, very modest China Phase 1 deal to try and mollify farmers and to reassure them that he is taking care of the recent trade impact on their businesses. And he even dropped a Middle East peace plan, which, while not a realistic plan, may well peel off some Jewish voters. So the president is trying to build from his base and reassure those who voted for him 4 years ago that he has taken action to solve their problems. And then finally, the events piece of it. Actually, you would have thought that the Iranian attack piece might have had a bigger impact, or that impeachment would have a big impact. Ironically, the big marquee controversies have declined in impact because of what I said in the beginning. In 2 weeks alone, we've been bombarded by dramatic marquee events. People just can't keep up. And so they are downgrading the impact of most of these issues, which in the past would have consumed us in the news for weeks or months. The one in the middle is the problem for him. A global virus, a global pandemic, which is already spread from China to, I see today, Hyundai is closing its plants in Korea. If that has even a modest impact on the world's economy, then it takes away the number one talking point the president had as he heads into the election, which is a booming economy, which we will hear again and again and again as the president says, this is a choice between America being Venezuela or America being the strong economic success that I have made it in the last 4 years. As you remember from the president's inauguration speech, a speech remarkable for its lack of upbeat moments, the president described a dark and dangerous dystopian world. He literally said there was carnage on American streets and that we're under siege from foreign competitors, Muslim terrorists, and we were being screwed by a Washington cabal. That's where he started. That was smart, because now he's going to try and transfer us into Morning in America, which is, of course...
Men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history.
This is the Reagan play. I think it's a little dangerous for Trump in that Reagan inherited Jimmy Carter's economy. But Trump inherited Barack Obama's economy was actually a good economy. It was a good economy that had a booming stock market and that had created tremendous amount of jobs, 16 million jobs. Third best job creation record in American history. So on now, who are we going to see run against this man? Because that's the most important piece, the candidate. That's the piece that he can't really control, but that will determine the outcome, given that people have seemed to discount the economy as the major factor. So as you know, we saw the Iowa results today, and that should get you thinking, okay, what's going to happen now? So for the first time in recent memory, we see Democrats have no winner-take-all states, which means it incentivizes folks to keep on accumulating delegates even if they're not number one or they don't win the state. Because you could be number two in every state and end up with more delegates than the person who was number one, but only won a quarter of the states, another person won a quarter of the states. So you're incentivized to continue on. That's why Bloomberg is actually buying all over the delegate-rich states. We've no superdelegates. We've only known superdelegates on the first count at the convention. You should always remember that. Hillary had 16% of the delegates at the convention were superdelegates. What that means is fundamentally, they can decide to go with any of the candidates. They're not tied to any candidate. That's how the party establishment ensures that we end up with an electable candidate. But of course, that backfired in the last election, and so a popular movement arose to say, no superdelegates, let the people decide. And let's see a bigger Super Tuesday so that we can kind of get a sense of where America is, and California moved up to the first of 3 Super Tuesdays, because the first Super Tuesday is March 3rd, and then a big block of states on March 7th, and then a big block of states on March 3rd, 10th, and 17th. And by March 17th, we'll award 67% of the delegates, and we should know who the candidate is going to be. Or we will know if we will have a brokered convention, because nobody's going to get to the 50 plus 1 votes in the first vote at the convention. In the second vote at the convention, now the superdelegates are involved, and now there's a scope for backroom deals and horse trading. This is all new as a result of populist swing in reaction to Hillary loss, which people felt the establishment was in part responsible for. The last time that happened was back when, 1968, Hubert Humphrey, the establishment, the boys in the smoke-filled room, chose Hubert Humphrey. It created a massive populist backlash in the Democratic Party and led to the rules being changed. And then in 1972, a populist candidate was elected in McGovern. McGovern lost every state in America except one in 1972. And, as you might remember, by 1980, the parties had reestablished control. Ronald Reagan was very much the establishment candidate, and he won. By 2000, though, small dollar donors and the internet had empowered the public again. So now we're back. And the real question, I think, is going to be, for us, is Bernie McGovern, or is he Obama? Because, the outsiders win. So Jimmy Carter won. He was the outsider. Bill Clinton won. Barack Obama won. Gore lost. Kerry lost. Humphrey lost. Mondale lost. And so there's a chance that the outsider is what really appeals in this period where people are demanding change. Hey, by the way, for this 78-year-old guy, I'd like to know who the VP is. I'm not sure a man who just had a heart attack and I'd like to know who the person is that's a heartbeat away from the presidency, to be honest. We also have the spring chicken in the race is Elizabeth Warren at 70, and Joe Biden is 78 as well. So Bernie's not in a bad place on paper, considering he won the Iowa caucuses. He's going to win New Hampshire. He could win Nevada. And he could be a big winner in California and come out with a lot of delegates. That leaves Biden only with South Carolina. So let's just look at Bernie. Yeah, he should be in a good place because he won 43% of the 2016 primary, 8 out of the 10 caucus states, most of the rural counties in America. He won every county in West Virginia. He's running on an electability mandate. I'm the one who can beat Trump because I'm the one that can most easily peel off the non-college white voters that left the Democratic Party for Trump. They actually support my agenda. And in fact, the polls bear that up. I mean, he beats Trump on paper right now. He's got momentum, leading in the polls. The problem for him is that only half the Democratic Party describes itself as liberal. Because we've got a lot of Hispanic voters, we still have some older, non-college educated white union voters, and we have a lot of African American voters. That's why Biden has to bide his time and he has to come out of Super Tuesday with a lot of southern state delegates. The clock is ticking for Biden because if he doesn't come out with those delegates, the establishment insiders are going to look for another candidate. And I don't think it'll be Pete Buttigieg. I think it might be the guy with $1 billion to spend in a primary and a guy to spend with $1 billion in the general. Because right now, people don't necessarily love Biden on his issues. They're supporting Biden because he's the one they think is most likely to beat Donald Trump. That makes a lot of sense. But it also means that when it looks like he may not be the one to beat Donald Trump, they're not stuck on him for his values or aligned values, and so they're willing to move to somebody else. The ones with the green stripes, the states with the green stripes, are the reason why Super Tuesday matters. Because after that insider narrative about Bernie has won all these New Hampshire and Iowa and maybe Nevada, really, Biden can clean up in these southern states that have a lot of weighted districts. So if you win those districts because they have a lot of minority voters, you get extra delegates. It's the big prize that can propel him back into the mainstream and save him. But will he be able to get through this difficult time without seeming like he has an electability or a sustainability issue? Because he's always had difficulty raising money. Here's our big problem in the Democratic Party. We have got these 4 buckets of people, and they don't all necessarily comfortably live under the same tent. We've lots and lots of women who really have drifted over to the Democratic Party in huge numbers because of their animosity to Trump, but they do have somewhat divergent views on the Democratic platform of issues. We've lots of young people, lots of white college-educated people who are the kind of Rockefeller Republican suburban voters. They may not share the same values as the 18 to 34-year-olds who are a little more progressive and left-wing. And then we've a lot of non-white people who, again, are actually a little more moderate. They're also not sometimes a comfortable place to share with the 18 to 34-year-olds. Right now, they all beat Trump in a head-to-head. And Bernie thinks that he has the best chance to beat Trump in those 4 to 6 states that are really the battleground states. Let's have a quick look at the Senate because it is impacted by this. And of course, in a big Democratic year, we're going to win the presidency and we're also going to be able to win the Senate, partly because of Tillis in North Carolina. I think we'll win in Arizona, we'll win in Colorado, and we'll a lot of Democrats are propping up Susan Collins, and I'm not sure that she won't be a inadvertent victim of the impeachment trial, even though it's not going to move a lot of voters. It may move the voters in Maine who say, we've had enough of her. In which case, we win the Senate, and we're going to hold the House. Because even though there are a lot of Democrats in districts that are those suburban districts that could be vulnerable, we have actually seen a lot of Republican House members leave, and they are now open seats. And the Democrats who are in those vulnerable seats, they've been able to raise more money than their competitors, and it looks like Democrats have the ability to maintain their place in the House. But if that doesn't happen, and Trump is elected president, and we don't, or we do with the Senate, it'll be back to the states. And this is what you experience every day. In the absence of federal solutions to a lot of the problems that people are talking about, the states have stepped up. The problem with that is a patchwork of regulations and rules and sometimes funding issues. But states is where the action's at, and states are making the policy running in the absence, again, of a federal solution. It's exciting, and it creates a lot of innovation. And again, Democrats lost 400 seats. They lost 800 seats during the Obama era and in many, many state houses. In fact, we were down to 14 governors, and now we're back to 24 governors, and we gained back 400 seats in the midterms in those state legislatures, and we would expect that that march will continue under a Trump presidency, and we should pick up a lot of houses and senates in the states in this year's election, leading to, again, more progressive movement on healthcare issues in state legislatures. Because that's where we want to focus our attention just for a couple of minutes. Ballot initiatives, also in the absence of federal action, have cropped up, and in fact, we even saw that Medicaid expansion due to ballot initiatives rather than executive or legislative action. Let's look at healthcare for a minute. Healthcare. Just ask in public, in the Gallup poll, what's your number one issue? Extremely important. Healthcare. Very important. 81%. Yesterday, the one thing we do know about the Iowa polls is that the number one issue for people coming out in exit polls was healthcare, whether you were young or whether you were old. Healthcare. Problem is, here's where the American public says they are. 28% say the system is broken. 39% says it's not working very well. Only 29% thinks it's good, and the 4% presumably that are in the concierge service think that it's working very well. But what we've seen is a slow drift and a slow movement in the nation's view of healthcare. And while it seems that sometimes in politics there are dramatic changes and that there are kind of a violent exchange of views, we've seen a slow, steady transition and change. Within 10 years, we saw people opposing a national health plan being crowded out by those that support a national health plan, and whatever that may look like. When it looks like expanded Medicaid, for example, we've seen it physically march across the country, whether by ballot initiative or state action. And even when you throw in some terminology that's meant to make people horrified, like socialized medicine, it still has a plurality of a national health plan. Universal health coverage is 63% positive. Socialized medicine still has a plurality. And that's something you're going to hear a lot of in the next year in the presidential election. Even in Texas, I shouldn't say even, but in Texas, universal system has 44% approval by the public. In fact, independents, a plurality of independents support a universal healthcare system. No matter who wins, they've changed the debate. And I think that's really the takeaway here, is that when you have a series of democratic debates where people are arguing about getting rid of private insurance, but saying, yes, of course we all agree we need a universal system. Maybe it's opt-in to Medicare or whether it's a mandated Medicare, but we want to preserve people's ability to have some private insurance. We're over here now. We've all agreed, well, we are going to have some form of buy-in to Medicare. We are going to have some expanded universal health care. We're only arguing about the private insurance piece. That's moving the public, and it's moving the center of gravity. And all of these candidates want an individual mandate. All of them want the federal government negotiating drug prices. And in fact, Nancy Pelosi's bill strikes me as something that could actually, in a less polarized time, find universal support and even be signed by the president. That's the tricky thing about President Trump. He's not as ideological as some of his predecessors. And if it looks like that's where the public is, he'll move to the public. It wouldn't surprise me to see him do that. Right now, he's taking care of the base. That's what the president tends to do. He talks to his base and then tries to peel off some marginal support elsewhere. Look, there's a long way to go. But I feel that for those of us in the room where healthcare is their number one issue, we're in the center of the conversation. I think that's exciting, and I think that's amazing. The public really wants answers, and they're really anxious. And I know that a lot of us spend a lot of our time tweaking a system. I'm working to some extent in the engine room, but the ship is actually moving in the direction that puts healthcare at the forefront of everybody's thoughts. Funding will flow to it. Time will be given to it on the debate stage. And change will slowly happen, partly because of the demographics of the country. younger people are very quickly replacing older voters. And there's a consensus, I think, among younger people that something has to happen in the area of healthcare. And within 4 to 8 years, I would actually expect to see a consensus emerge twofold. We probably should have a universal healthcare system that looks a little bit like Europe or Canada or some of the Scandinavian countries. And we really can't tolerate a dysfunctional Washington anymore that's not going to allow us to at least debate and try and move forward on those issues. Thank you all very much for your time. I think we'll take a question, DJ, if people want. I can't wait to see what happens. I know that you always have very, very difficult questions.
Yeah, thank you, Colm. I appreciate it. Let's give him a round of applause. Let's go to the center over there.
Hey, I'm Lindsay Lanigan with Legacy Community Health. We're an FQHC in the state of Texas. You saw the results just came in, the preliminary results for Iowa? Okay, well, Pete won. Do you want me to tell you right now? They're preliminary, so Pete is at 27%, Sanders is at 25%, Elizabeth Warren's at 18%, and Joe Biden is fourth with 16%.
Big story there is Joe Biden. That's why Bloomberg bought. Yeah. Bloomberg sees the opening, and it really won't be long, I think, before the Democratic establishment is starting to say, what's our move here?
And anymore, Iowa is sort of the benefit of Iowa is to get the bump in media, to get to New Hampshire, to get the bump to South Carolina, to get the bump to Super Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
So
now,
Bloomberg is.
I think that Pete gets kudos for his organization on the ground. Warren had great organization on the ground, and Sanders had good organization. We'll see if they're able to maintain that through the next few states. And then I think it'll be very difficult for Mayor Pete, just like Bernie Sanders. He has a challenge down south with African American voters, where he has shown it to be very difficult for him to make that connection.
It seems to me that the whole ballgame is California, because it's just not the whole ballgame, but
Texas
so
and California
delegates.
are both on the first Super Tuesday.
And they both are younger states, right?
Yeah, and right now Bernie Sanders is doing very, very well there.
Yeah.
But again, there's no reason to believe that everybody's not going to get a plurality. They're going to get their 15%, and they're going to be pulling out votes. So it'll take a little while for us to see. We don't see that domino effect. California's not the ball game this year, because you don't get all the delegates just because you won the state.
Right.
There's a momentum factor and a money factor. Biden doesn't raise a lot of money, and he doesn't raise it well. And so, momentum is important to him.
Yeah.
Which I do think is where we're going to see more and more talk of Bloomberg.
So Democrats head into the convention. I believe it's unlikely there will be a delegate. I think you've said that essentially here today, that there will be a majority of delegates for any one candidate. So they go to the first vote when everybody has to vote as assigned by their pledge, and then the second vote comes, and then it's wide open.
It's wide open, and now you got that 16% of superdelegates are back in. They're more establishment oriented, and Bloomberg has tried to have a strategy to buy enough votes so that he has real influence at that stage.
So
his assumption is that Bernie is the one with the plurality of votes, with the most delegates, but not necessarily 50.
So last question. This is really the most important one. I want to make sure the film's rolling on this one. In the first convention, and first brokered convention in 2020, since 1968, really.
Yeah, 1952.
1952.
Yep, Adlai Stevenson and Ike.
Since a long time ago. Who's going to win on the second ballot?
It's very exciting, isn't it? I know that I, for one, can't wait to see. I know that you'll be there, DJ. I know I'll be there. Wishing I wasn't, but it'll be a very fraught, very tense. I think the real question is not who will win on the second ballot.
Actually, it
or
is.
Third
That's
ballot.
the real question.
I think the real question is: will the people who lose support the people who won?
So the answer is it's not Bernie. The answer is this is my prediction. It's not Bernie. It's a slate of candidates that form a coalition. It's the only way they can get. Hey, I'm Jay Inslee. I'm going to be your EPA director. I'm Joe Biden. I'm going to be your Secretary of State. I'm not a straight white man. I'm going to be your president. I'm not a straight white man. I'm going to be your vice president. And Bernie is just really hacked off as a result.
Well, here's the question. 30% of his voters right now said that they wouldn't necessarily support the Democratic candidate if it's not Bernie. Mm-hmm. And do some of them in a huff go and vote for Donald Trump?
That's the question.
Happened in 2016, say some of us. Colm O'Comartun, founder of 50 State and former executive director of the Democratic Governors Association. Sir, thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause.